So today we have a discussion of psychoanalysis and social critique. I'm not going to introduce Amy Allen because she was in yesterday and everyone knows something about her work, but I will introduce Patricia Gherovici, who would be the English pronunciation, who is a psychoanalyst and analytic supervisor, as well as a senior member, analyst, supervisor, and faculty at FAQ Psychoanalytic Association in New York. She's the co-founder and director of the Philadelphia Lacan Group and associate faculty psychoanalytic studies minor at the University of Pennsylvania. She's published a number of books. I'll just highlight the Puerto Rican Syndrome, which was 2003, and Please Select Your Gender, from the invention of hysteria to the democratizing of transgenderism, which was in 2010. As you know from the Facebook post as well, there's a book that just came out in French. The title, I believe, is Lacan and so she will, her work kind of bridges both clinical practice and academic research on, obviously, psychoanalysis, but then, as you saw in the article I circulated and in the video, issues of transgender, transsexuality, queer, etc. And it would be nice to be able to foreground that because it's been something that's been coming up in some of the discussions that we've had, but it's not been in the forefront as of yet. So we decided that what we would do is Patricia can share some thoughts with us about this issue. Amy will do the same, and then we'll begin to generate a conversation around these issues. So no further ado, I'll just turn the floor over to Patricia.
Thank you. Very happy to be here with you today, and being able to be very patient. In challenge, we commonly assume the idea that psychoanalysis is a neutral science, completely divorced of social context, and at least in the American transmission of psychoanalysis, outside social elements, outside of history. Maybe to challenge that, and we will start with a personal history. I'm originally from Argentina, Buenos Aires, and for those who may not have had the chance to maybe being exposed to what is called the world capital of psychoanalysis. I come from a city where everyone knows about Freud and Lacan, any cab driver, any waiter in a restaurant, who we both Lacan with a curiosity. Even words that are specific to the Lacanian terminology are used as pick-up lines in cafes. If a woman is called hysteric, she would take that as a compliment, thinking not being a misogynistic comment, but rather a reference to how desire is put into motion, and in fact it's not addressed to her, but this idea of a woman that is beyond and is an impossible idea. And there are neologisms, for instance, as a permutation of hysteria, hystericia is a neologism that means to hystericize, which means flirting, again, desire, into motion, and so on and so forth. And just to give a little of maybe scientific context to this claim, look at the numbers. In all of the US, we have 91 Southern psychologists who very rarely would engage in anything connected with psychoanalysis. In Buenos Aires, in particular, but in general in Argentina, the numbers are 85,000 psychologists, but the population 8 times more than the US population, and anyone who is called himself a psychologist who has gone through the academic training at the university will most likely be doing clinical practice, and in probably 90% of the cases being practicing psychoanalysis, Freudian, Lacanian psychoanalysis. So given that context, in the late 80s, I left Argentina being warned by my friends, forget about psychoanalysis, forget about Freud and Lacan, you're going to the US. You will do nothing in connection with your conscience. And as we all know, and I think this is Adorno says in psychoanalysis, nothing is true but it's exaggerations. This was, of course, an exaggeration, but nevertheless, with the kernel of truth. And I found myself in the US with my formation as a psychologist, a diploma as a psychologist, and I found happily, easily a job in the barrio, in the Puerto Rican community in North Carolina. Where described in the medical terminology as Puerto Rican syndrome. I was there, the job I was working, I was as a what was called staff psychologist. I was working in a mental health clinic in the heart of Philadelphia's barrio. At the time, it was 90% Puerto Rican. I was working with a disenfranchised community that is caught in a kind of in-between situation, as at times the neologism Puerto Yorkers or New Yorkers explain, that don't feel fully franchised as American citizens. They are not seen as fully franchised American citizens, even though Puerto Ricans are American citizens, but still feeling faithfulness to the language. I have worked with people who have lived in North Philadelphia for 30, 40 years, didn't speak a word of English, and not just because they couldn't learn it. It was an issue of identity that it was important to preserve. And they come to the clinic presenting very mysterious symptoms that for anyone with maybe psychoanalytically alerted ears was interesting to notice that what I was observing was something that I thought was relegated to all psychiatric textbooks, which was the most classical form of hysteria. It's the same, thanks to which psychoanalysis was born, not too far from where we are here today, at the Salpêtrière Hospital, where Freud spent a few months in Paris studying with Charcot. He discovered this very theatrical form of hysteria with something that looked like epilepsy, that those seizures have no organic cause. And thanks to this mysterious illness for which medicine, traditional science could not offer an answer, when Freud comes back to Vienna, he starts treating these difficult, recalcitrant symptoms, and not only invents a new form of cure, psychoanalysis, but also discovers the existence of unconscious. So it's interesting I bring this because I find that my experience working in Philadelphia barrios is a challenge to this assumption that psychoanalysis is outside social concerns. And when I often talk about my experience working for 6 years in the barrio, practicing as a psychoanalyst, listening to the unconscious, often I may encounter disbelief, suspicion, surprise, and I think the underlying prejudice is that as if people would think that poor people cannot afford to have an unconscious. You laugh, or nobody would say that openly, but there is this idea that psychoanalysis should be relegated to Park Avenue, only those who can afford it could have it. And it's in a way neglecting the fact that even those patients through whom Freud discovered psychoanalysis were working class women, brought to the Salpêtrière. Freud, even if you look at the early texts in psychoanalysis in the studies of hysteria, we have upper class Viennese women, but we also have working class women. And what is interesting in the Puerto Rican syndrome, that maybe we could talk about, is that this syndrome was not diagnosed with frail, easily persuade them. We could maybe say that, of course, what took place was here in Salpêtrière was women that were easily hypnotized, and they were under the spell of this, the presence of Charcot, the most famous doctor at the time. And in the Puerto Rican syndrome was diagnosed among macho soldiers. They were Korean War veterans that were fighting. And so we have an interesting gender change. It was mostly diagnosed in male, and not perhaps in the frail presentation we could have thought of. But that's the interesting thing, perhaps with certain commonalities, if you think of the social position of women in Vienna in the 20th century and Puerto Rican soldiers who are part of maybe one of the last surviving colonies today. I will go there with giving you a little example of the clinical practice, Latvian psychoanalysis being practiced in a mental health center in the ghetto in in an office where I move around the furniture to recreate the Freudian theater. To give you a sample of what the place was like, it was a very rundown building, and the building itself used to be a funerary home, and I always had the suspicion that all these beautiful wooden panels and they were incongruent with the orange carpet and the formica paneling may have been the viewing room where corpses were left to receive the last goodbye. And it's interesting to see psychoanalysis there when it was then practiced in a place where maybe corpses were there to be viewed. So, and also a repercussion of the war situation that life in the ghetto has, where I would hear on a daily basis in the practice a report of a death, a neighbor, a friend. They said really appropriate. So maybe it's to make more pertinent the survival of lot of psychoanalysis, and I think it has to do with what we are discussing today, whether or not we engage with the social context.
Okay, so I guess I'll just say a few things about how I'm trying to understand the relationship between psychoanalysis and social critique in my current work. And I maybe it's right to think that I'm kind of approaching the question from the opposite angle, similar question, but so my interest is not so much in how psychoanalysis is embedded in or responsive to social concerns, but rather how social critique, if it's to be effective, requires or needs psychoanalysis as one of its tools, let's say. I mean, one of the starting points for the project that I'm working on now on this topic has to do with the strong relationship that has traditionally existed between Frankfurt School social critique and psychoanalysis. So the first generation of the Frankfurt School was very deeply engaged with psychoanalysis, and both intellectually and institutionally. So the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt provided a home for the Frankfurt Psychoanalytic Institute, and there was a strong intellectual rapprochement and cross-fertilization between people like Adorno and Erich Fromm, at least in the early days of the Frankfurt Institute. And, you know, really one way to understand what the early project of the Frankfurt School of Social Criticism was all about was an attempt to fuse Marxism and Freudianism into a new methodology for doing social critique. And the reason, I mean, basically the early first generation Frankfurt School theorists were Marxists who were trying to figure out why the revolution failed in Europe, right? They were trying to figure out why the revolution that was predicted by Marx's theory of history didn't come about, even though there was quite a lot of revolutionary, proletarian revolutionary energy in Europe in the early 20th century. And they felt that what one needed in order to explain that was a social psychology, was a theory of the psyche that they found in the work of Freud and psychoanalysis. And then later, of course, Adorno and also Horkheimer, you know, after World War II, after the disaster of the Holocaust, thought that psychoanalysis was even more important as a way of understanding this kind of descent into barbarism that they saw in European culture. So psychoanalysis always had a really prominent place in the Frankfurt School approach to social critique. And then there's a kind of interesting and I think mostly a story of loss, you know, in the history of the trajectory of that relationship more recently. So in his early work, Jürgen Habermas was very influenced by psychoanalysis, but his reading psychoanalysis was always quite different. So whereas for the early Frankfurt School, the key notion in psychoanalysis was the death drive. I mean, that's very related to Adorno's claim that in psychoanalysis nothing is true with the exaggerations, right? He thought of the death drive as one of the great exaggerations of psychoanalysis that nonetheless was key to understanding our own present, our own historical situation. Habermas, though, even when he was engaged in psychoanalysis in his work in the early 1970s, it was always a different reading of psychoanalysis. It was a much more rationalistic understanding of psychoanalysis and a much more linguistic understanding of Freud, but not in the sense of linguistic, right? An idea that what psychoanalysis tried to recover was a communication with the unconscious that had been somehow broken off, and that Habermas in his early work in knowledge and human interest writes as if, in principle, it's possible to restore this broken communication and to have the self become transparent to itself, and that that's the goal of analysis. And this is part of the jumping off point for the essay from Constellations that I sent Gabriel as part of this session. Anyway, after the early 1970s, after his book Knowledge and Human Interest, Habermas quite famously dropped psychoanalysis altogether. He decided that psychoanalysis was too speculative, and too biologistic. That was kind of his stated reason. But I think it's probably also the case that psychoanalysis was in some way out of tune or disruptive to Habermas's basically progressive and developmental kind of understandings both of history and of self. Because there's a big question about to what extent, if one takes on board, for example, the notion of the death drive, one can still make sense of something like historical progress. And that's always been a big question about the relationship between Freudianism and Marxism, going back to the first generation of Frankfurt School. And I think Habermas, in my sense, decided that these two things weren't compatible, and he decided to go for this developmental, progressive kind of understanding, both of history, but also of thinking about the self. And for that project, the theories of people like Jean Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg were much more compatible. And so he dropped psychoanalysis and sort of never looked back. And more recently, in the third generation of the Frankfurt School, Axel Honneth has, I think, quite interestingly and importantly, tried to revive the connection between Frankfurt School social critique and psychoanalysis, and argued for the importance of psychoanalysis for the project of social criticism. And I absolutely am in agreement with the reasons that he gives for why this is important. So he argues that it's not out of any faithfulness to an original historical program that critical theory needs to recover psychoanalysis. It's true that there was that original kind of connection, but that doesn't necessarily mean that critical theorists today need to engage with psychoanalysis. But he gives two kind of principled reasons for why critical theory really needs psychoanalysis in order to do the work of social critique. And the first reason is that critical theory needs what he calls a realistic conception of the person, where that means a conception of the subject that is not overly idealized, overly rationalized, right? That sort of takes human beings more or less as they are, so that we can be careful not to produce overly idealized and unrealizable kinds of normative decisions, right? And then the second reason that he offers is that, so he goes on to argue that psychoanalysis, which has the most developed theory of irrationality available, gives social criticism or critical theory this more realistic conception of the person that it needs in order to really be in touch with people as they are, as human beings as they actually are. And then the second reason that he gives is that if one wants to do social analysis, one really needs often to employ psychoanalytic categories precisely because people engaged in social action often are completely or mostly unaware of their actual motives for the things that they're doing. And so one needs to employ something like the category of the unconscious just to engage in the project of social explanation and understanding social events. And so, but then in response to this kind of like, these are the reasons critical theory needs psychoanalysis, Honneth goes on, I think, to take up a version of psychoanalysis notion of drives in general, but the death drive in particular, and any kind of innate predisposition towards aggression has been completely dropped out. And there's more that I can say about this, but I guess I would say, as a sort of shorthand worry about that approach, is that it actually ends up providing not a very realistic conception of the person, it seems to me, and that one that sort of suits a kind of normative idealism that Hannah claims he doesn't want, but I think he ends up with. So this is a long way of sort of saying that the project I'm interested in with respect to psychoanalysis sort of starts from this basic idea that critical theory really needs psychoanalysis because it needs something like a realistic conception of the person. By which I don't mean some kind of strong metaphysical realism or something like that. I'm not looking to psychoanalysis for an account of what people really are like, but naturally or something like that. But rather one that doesn't allow us to develop an overly rationalistic or overly idealized conception of the person that would then be too far out of contact with people as they are in our social world, right? But that I think, in agreement with the first generation of critical theorists, I think one core psychoanalytic idea that we need in order to have this more realistic conception of the person is precisely the death drive. And so the kind of version of psychoanalysis that Hannah adopts ultimately, I think, is unsatisfactory because it sanitizes and wipes out that notion. So in my own work, I'm really interested in going back to Melanie Klein, not because she's the only one who has the conception of the death drive, obviously, Kant does as well, but Klein, I think, is a really interesting theorist of the fundamental ambivalence of the drives, and she's someone who theorizes drive in a way that's also very social. It's very intersubjective and intrasubjective at the same time, and I think that makes for an interesting resource for critical social theory, which is also maybe has had too much emphasis on the intersubjective, but that's an important component of the kind of conception of the person in critical theory that I think needs to be preserved, and Klein, I think, provides a way of thinking about that in a really interesting and fruitful direction.
Great. I might start by formulating a question. If people want to jump in at any time, obviously do. I'd be curious, I kind of have a question for each of you, but in many ways the question could be asked to either of you. Patricia, I'd be curious, first off, to hear you more on the relationship that you see between certain models of psychic life within the psychoanalytic tradition and the specificity of their historical and social inscription. On a strong structuralist reading, some people would say, well, it's a model of psychic life, and then at different times for different societies, there might be minor tweaks or superficial changes, but the historical and social modifications don't go all the way down. In listening to you, it seems that they go pretty far down into the constitution of psychic life. And I'm just curious to know how far, and ultimately what the consequences are for psychoanalysis. If they do go all the way down, is there the risk then of saying something like, well, there isn't a single model of psychic life, and we have to retool psychoanalysis and our very understanding of it as a practice? What would be the coherence, if you will, of psychoanalytic practice if there's such variability across time and culture, society, etc.? And for that matter, Amy, I could very well ask you the same question, but the question I had more poignantly for you, and once again, Patricia, I'd be curious to hear a few thoughts on this, is the way in which, in your concluding remarks, you said that psychoanalysis is important for critical theory and social critique because it provides us with a more realistic conception of the person. It seems that mainly operates at the level of explanation. And I'd be curious about whether or not there are tools in psychoanalysis for transformation as opposed to explanation. Are there elements in the psychoanalytic tradition that allow us not simply to explain what's happened, but to gain traction over particular conjunctural moments and to change them? And if so, how do you see that happening, particularly if you're drawing on a reference point like the death drive? Could the death drive be something that would help us to re-articulate our understanding of social change? I don't know if Patricia, you want to start out?
Maybe I say that indeed the idea that there will be a kind specificity to psychic models was the argument used against whether or not psychoanalysis could be applied. Already the choice of word application, I think, is the wrong one. I think psychoanalysis can be practiced if we, with anyone who we assume is split subject, which means anyone who is in culture, in language, anyone who is speaking this, who we assume will have an unconscious, therefore could be an analysis. I think what is interesting, I was thinking of this idea of how psychoanalysis produces a social change. My intervention is quite limited as a clinician, but I don't think that that's a small position. There is an ethical responsibility for the practitioner, and there is also an ethical responsibility at stake in psychoanalysis. And I think this is the revolutionary potential psychoanalysis has. I have a form of practicing that aligns with the Lacanian concept of the psychic, and in which the unconscious is further Lacan, or in this formula is the discourse of the other, which is borrowing from Freud, who called the unconscious the other scene, and this idea that we are, when we speak, we are also spoken. So what Freud says that if we look closely to individual psychology, it's also social psychology at the same time. So I think that whenever we are doing individual clinical practice, we are also engaged in a social practice, and that has political consequences. And I think I was mentioning in passing the example of Argentina. One extreme example of that is during the dictatorship in the 70s. The biggest numbers of people who were disappeared, arrested and killed by the government, were people who were practicing psychoanalysis. The most students, the biggest group of students that were disappeared were students of psychoanalysis, of psychology. So in a way, the aberrations of the government are maybe will be read symptomatically as an indication that the practice of psychoanalysis is a political practice, that there is responsibility not just for the practitioner, but our role for the analysis. And I could give you maybe perhaps a clinical vignette to be illustrated. You read a piece on the history of sexology and transgender, the early days of transgenderism that could have been the beginning of a beautiful friendship that ended abruptly and horribly when the church was actively engaged with the Berlin society. And I write about those things because the couch for me is like a window in society, but a window that we can never close. So in that sense, it's open. We are never outside the social field, and we are never outside political implications and political responsibility. And for instance, when a patient who comes to the clinic in the barrio, who has had an experience of all the time being treated as infantilized, treated as a child, and never been seen as a subject. The fact that he's in the office, and maybe I don't know if we have time for the clinical vignette, the case of Sorbonne. Sorbonne was a woman who is a victim of social circumstances. She was working in a laundromat, and she had the late shift, and as the store was closing, she got shot in the head by robbers who came to take the little cash that was there in the laundromat, and they asked everybody to lie down on the floor. There were not too many people left, 4 or 5, and it was close enough. They happened to be more people than usual because her brother had brought her child to fetch her, and had ordered everybody to lie on the ground, and upon leaving, they randomly shoot at those on the floor, and she was the only person shot. So 6 months after this, happily, Socorro survived, and she comes to the clinic. And she came to see me not in a position that could be that of a political subject. They say not even that of an analysis. She was sent by the doctor who saved her life, and she accepted to be coming to the clinic because she owed her life to this doctor who saved her and felt that she wanted to pay him back symptom they want to work on, and she was there just sit in the office and cry unconsolably. And so I listened to her, and we find that crying gave room for speech. Some words starting to be expressed. And she initially, and this is interesting, there was no subject she would talk. The treatment took place in English. Most of my patients would then choose what language the treatment would take place in. Even though Socorro was from a Puerto Rican family, she grew up in Philadelphia, so she spoke English. And she spoke Spanish only at home with her family. And she was talking about what happened. And we could see that in that sentence, what happened, there is no subject. The event that took over, and eventually she started crying much less in the session, and there was an interesting permutation from the what happened to the accident. She talked about the accident. And so then we could see how there was a progression, an event that was so overwhelming, so much on the side of the death that didn't leave room for any subject to be part of that overwhelming eruption of the death drive, of the war field that the ghetto is. And she started talking about the accident, but the question was really, is an accident? Was it accidental that when she was shot, the police took hours to come, that the ambulance took forever to reach because the place is so dangerous that the police or the ambulance are afraid to come? Was it an accident? Or were there social overdeterminations that were not accidental? And it's interesting that if you look at the etymology of accident, has relations to the etymology of symptom, has to do with accident, is cadere, falling, and symptom also has to do with falling together. And with the work of her continuously coming to the clinic, she developed a symptom. So in a way, what we needed to do with Socorro was to transform what was an eruption of the drive, or what can be called the real, this impossible beyond words, into a more traditional presentation of the patient, and eventually she started having symptoms. She was complaining of headaches. And I was concerned because she, as a result of the bullets she received, she had some impairments, and some pieces of the bullet could not be retrieved from her brain, were left there. And the question was, were the headaches caused as an aftermath of the fact that she was shot? Happily, these were hysteric symptoms. There was no organic cause. She got CAT scan, and the leftovers of the bullet were not causing the headaches. They were a nice hysterical classic symptom, and in that sense, hysteria is we are grateful to have this manifestation because it's a good social barometer. There we have again in the clinic something that could be a very clean, neutral diagnostic marker. Is in fact we could read it also in a very extended way as a form of social link, social discourse, and also social barometer, because as symptoms change through history, patients change in their manifestation, there are central structures that so far seem to remain. Maybe there will be new structures being produced. So far, if we look at hysteria, it's a kind of diagnosis that has more than 4,000 years of history. They all surviving medical documents make reference to hysteria. So going back to Socorro, just to complete the vignette, eventually the accident gave way to a new formulation, and she started to talk about when I was shot. And you see a huge change. It's still passing the voice because it's when I was shot, but it's still, I think, a good way of telling an event in which she has some agency because I was shot, but she didn't have so much agency. And with time, the symptoms became maybe the banality of everyday life, which she started, like most patients in the ghetto, often when people say, wow, psychoanalysis only for people who are sophisticated, who have middle-class concern. I found certain universals, unhappiness in social or sexual relations, are universal. People talk about the black lights, talk about the dissatisfaction in life, and she starts talking about maybe more symbolizable issues, problems with her boyfriend, problems with her mother, and ways in which this overwhelming trauma became a more perhaps edible trauma, more what we read in the more traditional psychoanalytic literature. But to give you an example that maybe there is a cross, we cannot really, and then this is an objection that, of course, if we present it that way, nobody would object, but there is no class determination that will determine, or we cannot say whether a person can be analyzable according to income. And in that sense, there is a sort of universal of symptoms, but it's sort of structural over-determination that seems to repeat themselves over the centuries, at least for what we know of history.
Can I ask a question before I respond to your question? So, if I understood what you said right, Patricia, I think in response to Gabriel's question, you were saying at least the structure of the unconscious, which is a function of the relation to language, would be a kind of universal structure for anyone who is in a culture and speaks the language. So that structure is properly universal.
And anyone could read. And what the law is
With the content, let's say, could be, widely.
and even it's an advantage. Because I'm telling you, if somebody doesn't know what Freud and Lacan and cannot do analysis, better. Because if somebody knows too much about Freud and Lacan, often that's just persistent. At times, I may get a phone call of somebody saying, I want a Lacanian analysis. What's happening to you? It has to be something. That's it. But not a good one. That's an engagement more than, I rather say I like to wear red sneakers. That would be the better symptom.
But I think it's fascinating just the idea that and yet you told the animals then have to develop a symptom first, and then in order to be.
Yeah, actually, he stays you need to get to create this kind of symptom.
I mean, if one was thinking about the analogy between, the people trying to draw between critical theory and psychoanalysis, it would be interesting to think if, there needs to be cultural or social symptoms first before traumas can be worked through. But anyway.
Didn't do something I think you mentioned in your text. Where is the demand?
Yeah.
When we talk about social study, or psychoanalytical approach to social situations, in the case of Sorbonne, there was no demand.
Yeah.
She didn't want to work with the therapist, she wanted to treat the doctor, so there's not really a demand for treatment. It was creative in conference, and conference needed to be creative with time. You mentioned that also in your text. What is the conference? Is society believing that psychoanalysis could offer something?
Yeah.
Are they asking for something or not?
I can just say a couple words in response to your question. I mean, I also wanted to pick up on something that Patricia said, that individual psychology is also social psychology, which seems to be absolutely right, but I would also say the converse. Social psychology is already also individual psychology, of course. And that's why I think, as I said, the reason for the original uptake of psychoanalysis in Frankfurt's critical theory was the need for a social psychology that could explain what was happening, with the situation of the workers. I mean, that was really the kind of original impetus. But I think that's so. I guess I would say, critical theory, and not just critical theory, but any political theory. I think, Carl Schmitt said any political theory rests on a philosophical anthropology. There's always a conception of the subject or a conception of the person being implicitly or explicitly appealed to in any kind of theory of politics, of social critique. Because, and partly that's about explanation. But I don't think that's all of it. Actually, I think how we understand what the person is like. And that's all I mean by philosophical anthropology. I don't mean anything like really strong and weighted and physically there, right? Just a theory of the person, a theory of the subject is a philosophical anthropology for my purposes. So how we understand what people are like is to inform what we think are the possibilities for transformation. So, for example, if I think people are basically rational and geared towards communication with others, and that communication can be transparent, and we can reach agreement and consensus and so on, and that's my conception of the person is someone who develops the competences for that, that I call that autonomy. I mean, then that is going to enable a certain kind of normative vision, right? Where what we aim for is something like autonomy and deliberate democracy. I mean, so that's basically, in a nutshell, Habermas's conception of the person and his normative vision, right? But if one had a different conception of the person and we said, well, actually, communication with the other can never be transparent, even one's understanding of oneself can never be transparent, because we're internally split or driven by psychic conflicts, then you might end up with a different, that's going to place limits, I think, on what kind of normative conception you think we should strive for. I mean, if you accept the idea that often applies to Kant, right, that we don't want, that we want to think about a normative vision that's in some sense realizable, So I think, so I think the explanation and the kind of what are the possibilities for transformation actually go hand in hand, right? And that adopting a more ambivalent philosophical anthropology, which is what I think one can find in the work of someone like Melanie, will have implications for what we think is possible politically and socially. But in a way that, and this is where the more realistic conception of the person thing comes in, that I think are helpful because the sort of overly idealistic, overly rationalistic, overly normativized vision of what's possible that motivates the work of someone like Habermas, with this ideal of kind of genuine consensus or actual rational deliberation as functioning probably seems so out of step with what actually goes on in real politics. It's really unappealing for a lot of people, right? So a more, an account that's more grounded in a more ambivalent conception of the person seems like it could give us more normative traction because it's closer to the world that we live in and something more, rational deliberation. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just anybody wants to, Amanda, you want to jump in now?
Yeah, it's been really exciting for me. So I have kind of constellation questions around the theme of contingency. Because it seems like, Patricia, you sort of said nicely, this connection between symptom and this notion of fallenness. And I wonder if that's one way for us to conceptualize psychoanalysis as being not this discipline that sort of engages in this trans-historical claim about structures of the subject, but a kind of openness to the contingency of subjectivity itself and also of those very theories of subjectivity. I mean, and one example of this is thinking through this turn to climate is fascinating, although I'm a little bit skeptical about it only because of her reliance on this kind of studies of children. It seems to me that if we really want to talk about a kind of psychoanalysis that's not going to sort of mimic some of the social scientific kind of reductive, rationalized accounts of the subject or something, there's something about this study of children that pushes me in this direction of thinking maybe we do need to turn to account to someone who has a theory of the subject that's based on language and contingencies that can be that don't have this kind of almost pseudo-scientific seeming studies of childhood as the basis of. So this the kind of object relation stuff I'm skeptical about as the ground for something like a social psychoanalysis. So I guess that's one challenge question. So I'd like to hear you say more about Melanie Klein, but then also to think through in this kind of broader question that Gabriel posed, the absolute sort of self-reflective contingency that seems to be in psychoanalysis in ways that aren't there in other forms of subjectivity as far as I can tell, especially these kinds of ones that insist on rationality and self-transparency.
Just briefly, I'll respond to the question about Klein. I mean, Klein engaged in an analysis of children, so she didn't really do observational studies. I mean, it may be that she's sort of the forerunner of something like I share your concerns about that. I think there are really deep methodological questions about that whole body of research and how much can be inferred, about this, what the infant's experience is like based on watching the infant, and where it holds its gaze and all that kind of stuff. So, but that's not, for better or worse, whatever. That's not how Klein operated. And I say that because a lot of people think, oh, her work is way too speculative because she wasn't doing that kind of observational, empirically confirmable kind of work. But I guess I would be sharing with you the sense that that's actually a good thing. I mean, she was, I think, she did get engaged and based some of her observations on her clinical work with children. But I think that's a different thing. I mean, Freud, of course, based a lot of his theories on his clinical work with patients, right? So I see that as more of a salutary aspect of Klein, and it goes hand in hand with the focus on the pre-edible, in the work of a lot of the great feminist psychoanalytic theorists like Rigore and Stego and so on. So I would push back a little bit there. But something else I was going to say about contingency. Oh no, this isn't about contingency, I guess. But I guess I would say what I find really interesting in Klein too, and I think, although I'm no expert on Lacan, I'd be interested in hearing what Patricia would say. I think this might be compatible or in conversation with the Lacanian model. What I think is really interesting is the way in which she theorizes the psyche in pretty much non-developmental terms. So she has these two phases, the two positions, the schizoid and the depressive position. And she and the depressive is sort of the mature achievement for her, but it's not a stable developmental state, right? There's always an oscillation between these two positions. So there's a kind of a fundamental ambivalence there in the psyche that can't really ever be overcome. And even the depressive position, as I read it in Klein, is about tolerating the ambivalence of the drives. It's not about reconciling or overcoming that drive or something like that. It's just about tolerating their that duality. And I think that's really interesting. So it's in a way about tolerating a kind of and being able to have a kind of split subjectivity. And that's as I understand it, the goal of analysis for Klein. And I think that's a very productive thing for thinking about social critique. I mean, to go back to what I was saying to Gabriel, that if that's our model of the person, then we could think about, our goal in terms of politics, not about achieving rational deliberation or full recognition or something like that, but tolerating ambivalence and the duality of, and the existence of the death threat, and also, as Klein theorized really beautifully, the ability and willingness to repair when disruption inevitably emerges in human sexual relationships.
When you look at you raise the issue of contingency, the vignette, I often all about contingency or not, the contingency, the way she was drowning in contingency, when she couldn't even speak, and why she shot another person to her right or left, like her. It was at times, why did it happen? I skipped that, and I think you listen well to regarding the narration that there was a period in the treatment was she was trying to find a guilty party, the cause that would eliminate contingency. And I was thinking maybe to bridge or to maybe mark the difference between Kleinian and Lacanian approach, that perhaps Klein, and I'm thinking of in your case, little deep, that she's offering to the child a sort of imposition of the structure. It says, this is the station is the body of your mother, this is the train wants to go inside into the body of the mother, and you're going to train, and the train, of course, you know, is a Filipino, she doesn't say, she's more polite than Donald Trump. But the time metaphor was used. And so then we want to do this, or this. In a way, she's forcing the universal medical structure, eliminating contingency, while giving the part to play a role to play in this structure in all its contingency. where I think, and Lacan works a lot on Melanie Klein, and if you look at the seminars, he's making reference a lot to Melanie Klein, who is in great admiration of her clinical skills, and her wonderful description of what Lacan would call the imaginary. And I think in the imaginary register of the death drive, and what perhaps is, and also the use of the symbolic as well, when she offers to deploy space. Here is the train, so she offers a sort of kind of prototype for a signifier. This, as I was saying, metaphor, this train could be your penis, could be you, and the station could be your mother's body, and gives toys to play and to create metaphors. And for those who may have read the case, also in the space of the office, little Richard would hide between two doors, so there is often this creation of what we may see in language as metaphors, symbolizations, and displays. Where Lacan and Melanie Klein do not agree would be in the notion presented of what is not contingent structure. For Lacan, you can only be psychotic, become crazy, if you are structurally able to. And that's why I edited a collection called Lacan on Madness. Madness, yes, you can. Precisely to play, like you never know go mad if you want, it's only if you're able to. And for time, there is indeed this idea that one could move from manic and depressive position to schizoparanoid, and we can move from psychotic to non-psychotic. And in fact, in clinical presentations in which you could consider someone who becomes psychotic and then no longer be. From the Lacanian perspective, you are only, if you're an orange, you cannot be an apple. If you're psychotic, you could be completely quote-unquote normal and extremely well in society with a parallel structure, maybe not as well as in Europe, but there will be clear distinctions between psychic structures, and you will have symptoms that could be crazy, madness, for instance, that there couldn't be this movement between structures, and that's where maybe in terms of society, perhaps the word would be, are we in a society that is psychotic and has moments in which it's still stabilized and moments when there are breakdowns, or we have a model that is more neurotic, and at times it could be manic or mad manifestations that then would always be over-determined by structure that we know is sometimes.
Amanda, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, well, maybe just to share the kind of intuition that seems to be at play and relevant here is that it seems like we are talking a lot about the way in which psychoanalysis can help us understand like, the subject of politics in this perspective way, important and interesting, but it seems to me that like some of the most interesting and helpful ways of utilizing the toolbox of psychoanalysis in relationship to theory would be more about like looking at sort of systems of power and helping with the kind of pathological or self-destructive kinds of like some of the most interesting arguments I feel like around the death drive, where it's not so much about subjects, it's about kind of like the death drive of institutions and structures and such. And so I guess it's somehow related to some of the discourses on institutions that have been coming up around these questions and relationships.
It might also overlap with a broader question that comes out of both of the pieces that we shared, and that is, what exactly is the relationship between individual psychic life, if we want to make these distinctions, and social psychic life, for lack of a better term? Obviously, both of you are kind of defending a position in which, well, they're implicated or they're intertwined very intensely, but for thinking, social, political practice, do we need slightly different tools, or can we operate on the assumption that there are kind of analogical structures or mimetic structures that are more or less the same, even if there's a close entwinement between the two, perhaps to the extent that we can't even say, well, here's where the individual starts and here's where society stops. If we're doing an analysis in a clinical setting with an individual versus when we're analyzing an institution or a set of power structures, can we use the same tools? And if so, what allows us to make that translation between the two? Is it analogy? Is it mimesis? Is it...
Maybe what we could add, I was thinking, listening to the discussion, thinking in terms of change. Well, does anything change in analysis? Do we want to change society? I can only talk about the clinic. The changes in the clinic are when that's what makes my work interesting, is that the unconscious only opens and closes immediately after. There is lapsus. I say, I want you to say Mr. Smith, and I say Mr. Ship. And then something, or a patient who says in the first session, this says something unusual, brought a dream with a magnificent motorcycle made out of steel. And I ask the question, what comes to mind to this steel? And the patient is very upset. How do you know that I shot him? I never ever wanted to bring this up to my analyst. So there's another look at them close up, but that is the consequences. And this is the idea of change. That I think what many, perhaps if we could introduce the truth, but for us in the practice is the truth that changed the way that subject will look at herself or himself from that moment on. In the case of this analysis, he could no longer bullshit about his own shoplifting. Not because I had any moral judgment. I don't represent the laws of the city in the office, but he was no longer in the same position facing this compulsion, because he said that aloud in the office in front of an analyst, who he had a sort of projections about what they were going to think that probably had nothing to do with my thinking. I'm prepared for that thing. The important thing is what the analyst will construct. And I think there are always the constructions of maybe new fictions, but there is always a kernel of truth. And I was thinking in terms of, when we were talking about explanation, that's what came to me. How change and truth may work.
Yeah.
I have a kind of almost the same question from the other perspective of the individual versus the social, where especially in Patricia, your clinical work, where you were pointing to a situation where when you're analyzing people who are extremely lower class, who have all of these social conditions upon them, which make them their lives far more difficult than other people in the U.S. What do how to kind of help ameliorate the individual situation that was actually caused by social infrastructure? How to, is there a sense in which in your work you attempt to influence the social by means individual change? How to bridge this gap between these vast social problems that in fact cause directly these symptoms, in a very different way than they would apart from having it. How do we bridge this gap?
I think that social problems can be addressed by social means, but that doesn't mean that as an analyst I don't have a responsibility. If I can change one by, it's always one by one. Even if you're in Maccabi or if you're in a hospital seeing 100 people a week, that most people working in mental health center have a caseload of 100 patients a week. But you can still introduce change, and it's always one by one. So, but the one by one could have repercussions. Of course, I think there are things that need to be addressed by other means, but that doesn't take away the individual responsibility that I have as a practitioner, and that the person who can, I thought it was something extremely transformative for people who are always treated like things, to be heard as a subject. So that in itself was an important revolutionary change, also in the dynamic, because I often people tend to be, there is such a need that they need to be told what to do. I abstain from that because I don't think that's helpful ever. And it's more pertinent in that social context that, of course, the patients and the people that work with that, they really had probably better survival skills than I had at the time, because they managed to live in very dire conditions. And the idea was to reverse where was the knowledge, where was the power, and the power was to return to them that agency, at least during the time of the session. That and what they said had a value that belonged only to them, and I was there just to be able to catalyze that movement. And in that sense, I believe that that in itself is social change. Even though
What about just flipping the model entirely? Because that's why we've been talking about how psychoanalysis and critical theory might gain some critical purchase over society or over individual psychic life. What about, and this comes out, I think, in the work that both of you do, the extent to which both critical theory and psychoanalysis need to learn from society, perhaps even unlearn certain of their structures and forms, so to become the student as opposed to being the teacher. And I think this is very clear in Amy's work, anything from decolonization to feminism to queer theory, etc. It's reworking certain critical tools from practices that are ongoing, modes of resistance and modes of transformation. It comes out very clearly in the work that you shared with us, Patricia, with the idea that psychoanalysis needs a sex change. So trans culture and trans practice actually making it such that psychoanalysis needs to a certain extent wake up and learn from things that are going on. So I'd be curious to hear both of you on this process of unlearning or retooling psychoanalysis and critical theory in relationship to practices, particularly because both of you are working in such a way that it seems that both of these traditions are behind the curve to a large extent. Like they missed the boat. And so how can we get them back on boat? And how can that actually be part of the process?
But maybe that, yeah, I mean, that seems right, but maybe that there's also in the tradition some sort of more critical potential that hasn't been realized, and I think that's implicit in your work.
Right.
But I don't know if this addresses your question directly. I might still be thinking about like 2 questions ago a little bit, but so for me. But I mean, I just think about the relationship between the individual and the social. I mean, there's been in the history of critical theory and the Frankfurt tradition this fusion of Marxism and Freudianism, but there's also been a strand in critical theory that's a more classically Marxist strand that's really suspicious of psychoanalysis, and precisely the suspicion is that psychoanalysis psychologizes and individualizes problems that are really properly understood as social or political problems and that should be addressed socially and politically and not the individual level, because addressing them at the individual level accommodates, people to their own social misery, right? So this is not, I mean, I'm not agreeing with you, I'm just saying that there's always that strong line of critique as well. And I think that's a wrong-headed way to think about it, but it's responding to maybe somehow an assumption or a perceived assumption that if we just transform the individual, that like automatically the social transformation will follow. And I think both of those are really problematic assumptions. So to say that the individual psyche is always also social and vice versa is not to say that changing individuals, even a large number of them, will automatically result in social transformation. I mean, there are institutions and structures that have to be changed, and that requires a different kind of institutional and social.
And would you say vice versa?
And vice versa, yeah. I mean, one thing that has been really interesting to me in some of my work is how you can have social transformations that individuals psychically are out of tune with, right? I mean, one example of this maybe is the way that the women's movement and women's increased role in work and so on in American society transformed radically women's position in society, and but many women don't affectively feel quite conflicted about that, right? So their own relationship to their own work, to how that changes their relationship with their mothers, to their children, guilt about that. I mean, all of these kinds of things are symptoms in a way where there's a kind of social transformation that hasn't necessarily resulted in the kind of individual psychic transformation where people feel okay with that. I mean, that's just one example, but I think that as I would see it, what psychoanalysis can do in terms of thinking about the question of social is maybe place some limits and constraints on what our theories of the social might look like. But I don't think it automatically generates a theory of the social. I mean, that requires then elaboration and thought about institutions, about structures, about power relations, about social practices, and things that go beyond, would have to be thought in relation to psychoanalysis, but not aren't totally
remember any conversation?
It's sort of a follow-up question to Gabriel's question. To what degree do you think that everybody needs to be on the same boat? Isn't it possible that some of us miss the cruise and we're waiting on the shore to those of us who are on the cruise ship, which, hopefully doesn't get a major staff infection or sink, but do we all have to be on the same boat? What is gained by having us on the same boat? And I guess conversely, what might be generated from not having us on the boat?
I think we are trying to prevent psychoanalysis from sinking. Because I agree with you. Why not having regatta or if you don't want to stay on shore? But the idea that certain practices of psychoanalysis, or I would say of psychoanalytic institutions, because if you look closely, certain positions of psychoanalytic institutions contradict psychoanalytic principles, make psychoanalysis sink.
So why not let them, it sounds like this is a preoccupation with decay and death, right? But I don't necessarily know if all decay and all death and all sinking is negative. Coral reefs often grow in the bodies of old shipwrecks. If you put something dies in the forest, often the forest floor will take it back, put the nutrients in weeds, and make something else. So why try and revive something that might really just need to have a DNR?
Yeah, for me, it feels like a Titanic psychoanalysis certain practice, but it is, and this is something that Lacan said. Psychoanalysis is a symptom of capitalism. When we are done with capitalism, there will be no need for psychoanalysis. So far, it looks like capitalism is still floating. So I think, and the problem that people are practicing in their offices, and people are looking for help from analysts, and there have been horrible deviations from the psychoanalytic practice and terrible clinical analysis. And this is a little what I denounce, where I say psychoanalysis needs a sex change, because I think this is not without consequences. As long as there are people who are consulting psychoanalysts, and their psychoanalysts who have a reactionary position in their offices, they will have a problem that we need to address. And then maybe let the Titanic become a coral reef, especially when now coral reefs are in danger. So.
Yeah, I'm interested in what this topic of the relationship between psychoanalysis and capitalism specifically. On that note, whether you can understand psychoanalysis in terms of resistance, in many ways I think we can, because it's a slow process, it's in a sense non-instrumental and so on. And in Sweden, the whole kind of industry is large oriented on quick fixes and medicine and so on. But then again, I'm thinking about, in a historical sense, a very important essay by Georg Zimmermann on metabolism and life, and which you might also be very familiar with, and where he sort of observes what life in the big capitalist city does in terms of changing people's sensibilities and identities and so on. And I'm also struck by that kind of overlap between Zimmer and Freud, because they were at the same time. And the notion that, or I don't know if this is true, this is how I understand it. The spatial elements of psychoanalysis, the kind of consistency of that room where it needs to play out, but also the need to pay for having access to that room, and how payment is so incredibly important in psychoanalysis. Like, if you can't pay, you have to pay a little bit to get a relation. You can't just let your parents pay for it. So there seems to be a really sort of pent-up idea about payment and money. So I'm wondering about notion of money as a medium for setting up relationships and making things possible or making impossible. Very broad personal approach. I'm curious.
You're raising a very important point. How, if I recall correctly, psychoanalysis is a symbol of capitalism. So not more like symptoms that could be, she says, enjoy your symptom, or could be a symptom that could be something paralyzing, a manifestation of something, or a barrier of meaning, if you think of America, or something that could be sort of pathological formation. On the other hand, you're bringing a very important point, which is money and capitalism and exchange. I'm working in North Philadelphia, where people who initially supposedly so seemingly free treatment at the time, they would not have to pay, and they will pay back anyway because they are not outside capitalism, even though they occupy a marginal position. They are now maybe part of the traditional product, means of production, because they work in a population with 3 generations of unemployment. So they produce symptoms. So they don't produce commodities, they produce symptoms. And they spend a lifetime going from one clinic to another. The people who have their profession, their career would be being professional patients. And I don't say that ironically, it has to do with what kind of social locations society grants them. On the other hand, psychoanalytic position reverses that kind of capitalistic exchange. In capitalism, we exchange money for commodities. Go to store, we give money and get purchase a bottle of water. In psychoanalysis, this is reversed because we pay to work. And this is a paradox that we give the commodity, the agreed, the unconscious, the free association, and we pay for that. And in that sense, there was an interesting reversal. It's no longer the capitalistic model of exchange, and even when I was mentioning the idea of often, from somebody like Neil Altman, he has worked on practicing the value from interpersonal client and position. And he noticed correctly that most of the professionals belong to middle class, or have education, they have to be practicing in a clinic. There is a requirement of at least a master's level of PhD. So obviously there is a class difference. Most of the practitioners are white, at the time they were mostly male, so there was this big class, gender, race difference. Nevertheless, there is the possibility and the potential to reverse that, because in the moment in the session, the one who knows is not the professional with the diplomas, but rather the knowledge is in the unconscious. An unconscious that will be produced by the interaction of page analysis and analyst. And the knowledge will eventually belong to the analyst who will do something with it or not, or drop it. Simply, maybe some element of truth will allow, in the case of Sorbonne, she dropped the position of being the victim into maybe checking her enjoyment in being victimized by horrible circumstances, but also the secondary events, because the accident transformed completely what we call the accident. That is not comparable to an accident on the highway, but nevertheless the accident ran her in a different position with her mother that she benefited from, and then eventually she was able to fall and regain agency. So there is a potential to play within the capitalistic rules, but differently. And in that sense, we are done.
No, I mean, I guess I have a question about the idea that psychoanalysis is a symptom of capitalism. I mean, just what that means in the context. Can you say more about that? I mean, I thought what you said about your clinical vignette was wonderful, but I guess it seems at odds with the idea that there is, that you were talking about earlier, that there is a model of psychic life that's split, and the unconscious is produced by that split that's kind of universal to all culture and language. So
I think he was referring to the Hegelian notion of history that eventually
it's a culmination.
it will end, capitalism will end, and something else will treatment, and there would no longer be psychoanalysis. It's symptom. But for what we see, I don't think we will see that. Maybe some later.
I know Gabriella coming up in control, but maybe you want to respond to directly to this?
To Barbara Cassand's work that sort of sees Lacan as the sophist. I mean, very much like it might be helpful to think through. It's not the case that like maybe psychoanalysis is the version of sophistry that is the system of capitalism, in the way that sophism was the version of a relationship to a certain exchange relation that has to do with like teaching people how to speak for money in ways that. I mean, there's a lot that can be said about her work, but I do think that this parallel between sophistry and psychoanalysis is one way to think through what it means to say that psychoanalysis is a system of capitalism. That would not just do away with the kind of claim that there are these structures that think of psychoanalysis.
And also, the money is the only real we have. When an analysis doesn't work and we increase the fee, could be nominal. $1 or $2 or $5, suddenly an explosion could arise. So it's good volcano to have in the office. If we see that the thing it's the only, we have, as Allen, we have not too many tools. And the only real we have, that's why I often hear people say, oh, I would like to be in analysis, I cannot afford it. What we pay with is not really money, but enjoyment, jouissance. We love our symptoms more than we love ourselves. For instance, at the time, symptoms could represent a person's erotic life, and they are more invested than their actual erotic life. So, supposedly, a symptom is something that one would give up in analysis. That little bit of jouissance could be mobilized. I think they would say that the only way you get a person to tell the truth is that in their pocket. So we do that a little with money, and I think this is an important point. And in the back of my experience as a clinical director, I was in a clinic that was free, and I asked for a nominal copay of $1 copay. The people who come drinking a soda that they pay for $2 or $3 outside the office, so they were living their own welfare, but they're not outside capitalism. And the fact that we were asking for this copay, that was nominal, for us, really created confidence that then people will not miss sessions as much. The practitioners were feeling better, so then we had discussions of clinical group supervision. Suddenly the engagement, because it's often a problem in clinics, is the burnt out, is the alienation with the big other, that the work for the practitioners, they feel is not really well paid, is not valued, is not appreciated, there's a session. Suddenly there was a copay, and the whole dynamic for all people involved got transformed. With that little piece of the real we have, which is money, which is, I think, the most symbolic thing at the same time. If you look at it, I had once in Argentina, we're given a fake banknote, and suddenly you realize how much illusion that we try this, or you may have that now using euros, so suddenly those like, circus promotions, this is the thing with the strange colors and shiny things. We don't really have the same transparent value that we do with the bank, the kind of currency we're used to. So in a way, it's a currency that allows for things to move. And that's why I do again the issue of change. And I wonder, what would be the equivalent of that real in the social field? I'm curious about how could we touch the real when we deal with the social.
There are other
That would be my question.
There are other questions we can add to the file as well if you want. I know Gabriella and Kinjal will have that.
Yeah, this is a department in a different direction, but I was just wondering, it seems like a lot of contemporary sort of therapy and practice draws on all of these different models. That psychoanalysis is one of them, but you have CTW, cognitive behavioral therapy, and like mindfulness, and there are all of these different models for thinking about psychic life. And I am wondering do you see any usefulness in drawing upon these tools for either individual? I mean, in individual therapy, that's maybe something that each individual will sort of decide, but do these kind of models offer anything for
of cognitive behavioral therapy or psychopharmacology or other kinds of approaches, and their success in treating individual patients as, as evidence for this irrelevance of psychoanalysis. I mean, I'm not an expert on the clinical stuff at all, but so my sense is, from what I understand of the clinical literature, that these other approaches can be useful for alleviating or ameliorating symptoms of certain kinds of neurotic problems and other kinds of psychological problems, but that they certainly don't work in the same way and aren't as effective for all, and in some cases you need a combination of different kinds of these treatments in order to produce relief. So I guess, but what I would say about these other approaches is I don't think that they provide the same kind of philosophical conception of the person or the individual that seems to me to have the kind of implications for theory that I'm interested in. So I feel like mostly, since I'm not a clinician, I want to set aside the clinical question and say, yes, of course, maybe different, in some sense, what's going to help people the most. I don't want to be judgment about that, but I do want to say, I don't think that there's anything rivaling the psychoanalytic theory of the irrational and the person that one can find, behind, as an edifice behind cognitive behavioral therapy. Or, that's just behaviorism. And I think we all know that theoretically what the limitations of behaviorism are. That's been much discussed for 50 years. So, or psychopharmacology, that just goes, I don't see there a kind of set of theoretical resources. And I also don't think that analysis stands or falls with this, kind of question of the empirical, validation of it. I mean, as I see it, analysis is a theory of the person, of the psyche, that can be kind of reflexively applied in one's understanding of oneself. So I think the question of kind of empirical confirmation or disconfirmation is sort of beside the point. And I realize that would be a claim that would require a lot more argument to sustain, but that's my...
I just wanted to say I had it was by no means like an attack on psychoanalysis. I just sometimes get the sense that it seems like there's all this research, not in terms of individual approaches, but all of this research being done in cognitive psychology or neuroscience. And do we think that those kind of models of psychic life are just too? Do we think that there's anything to draw from that research that's being done in terms of critical tools for thinking of society at large? Or is it, as you're saying, that what psychoanalysis offers is actually a very developed philosophical reflection on the person, and that is what is missing from something like neuroscience?
I mean, I would say, I'm not an expert on neuroscience or the philosophy of neuroscience, but from what I have read, to some, it's not a theory of the psyche at all. I mean, it's and they have a very 10 most have a very productive view about what can be read off of, different parts of the brain lighting up and what we can work from that and so on. So this isn't true of all of, and that reductionism goes both ways. So there's, there are some neuroscientists who do their studies of and it's always a very small number of brain scans and fMRI scans that they'll then generally make these massive look at these, the way these brains light up and these, dozens of studies that we've done, and therefore we can conclude that free will is an illusion. And I just think that's silly, There's a lot of bad philosophy that's going on by neuroscientists. And on the other side, there are some philosophers who have kind of glommed onto the work that's being done in neuroscience because it suits something like their naturalizing agenda or their kind of pre-existing, this isn't all of it, but I think that's a lot that goes on there. And there may be important implications for thinking about certain kinds of questions in, let's say, analytic philosophy of mind
more.
There is, just for the number of questions, there's 1, 2, 3. Is anybody else got anyone in? Because we're arriving more or less at the end of our time, but I don't want to squeeze people out. So, who is following up on the conversation you just had? Okay, why don't we hear from the two of you first, and then Andrea and Kinjal? Maybe both of you want to ask your questions or make your comments, and we'll see if there's a response, and we'll ask the final two. So go ahead.
Well, I think there are other alternatives to obscure psyche, and that is to neuroscience. You know this book by Moncio, who writes Data Spinoza, and Malboum, who writes, for the Hegel and so on. But what I'm really want to ask you is the kind of revision working done by the Paris, specifically at the moment, parallel to what you were saying earlier about private school, why didn't the revolution happen, we work on Marx and Freud, which is exactly what they do after 68. And I think that I think there's so much role that remains in their work, and it's not just a simple critique, but it's really development and advancement, and I think that has been really significant and has linked to neuroscience in really interesting ways. And I would say that is definitely a philosophy of society that is realistic. So are you, is that interesting? Are you person critique or the progress even?
Well, I'd say one sentence. I agree with you about Deleuze and Guattari for sure, but I just don't know about how that has been taken up or implicated in neuroscience. So that there I just think but I would be interested to know.
I have a similar question and thinking back and looking off of what Gabrielle said about cognitive science as well. Well, given that there is now in the U.S. this massive sort of rejection of psychoanalysis in favor of cognitive behavioral therapy almost exclusively across the board, and the lack of practitioners in psychoanalysis, as you mentioned, and going along with that, a turn in literary studies in the last, I think, 10 years that is suddenly interested in cognitive science relations literature, which I find kind of bizarre most of the time. It's completely strange, but that and digital humanities, but that's another issue. But to what extent can we use an effort to continue this psychoanalysis as a mode of resistance against these cognitive theories and against a kind of capitalist sort of notion of psychopharmacology and in relation to psychiatry and all of these things, how can an emphasis from the academy to continue this effort to use psychoanalytic works in not only academic but also clinical practice can be a form of resistance against these kind of trends that are kind of terrifying.
Yeah, in the US, I think I'm happily, for example, original psychoanalysis has been medicalized very early on and has been sort of subspecialty within the medical field. And at some point, only MDs could practice psychoanalysis, and that changed and moved on to psychology. So there has been already sort of scientification and severe distortion of what we may call communism. Most people who train today in traditional psychoanalytic group don't read Freud. And most students who study psychology may not even want, before the token was a Hitchcock film, that doesn't happen, but not even that. So there has been sort of a constant attack to psychoanalysis, but kind of disquieting, disappearing, but I think it has to do with the fact, we may even say that already was supposed to be psychoanalysis was a severe medicalized distortion that has little to do with the aims working and what maybe has had a repercussion in academia. And nevertheless, it's always surprising me. Go online and check the cover of Time magazine, Newsweek, or any main news. Every 2 or 3 years they have the cover. Freud is there. Yeah. Is Freud there? And I always say, is he there yet? and over again. So the main model on the one hand seems to be sort of spectral presence, a code that is haunting us, and the question would be maybe one element, like I said, that supposedly it is me, that when Freud came to America to give the famous lectures, he told you, oh, they don't know, we are bringing them the play, that is all a fiction, that in fact, Freudianism hasn't yet happened. So Lacan's return to Freud, we may need to first have a Freudianism in the US in order to then have a return to Freud. And in my practice, I would say I'm more a Freudian than a Lacanian. So we say that we still may need to want to let Freud finally die for the movement to start.
This reminds me, there was the title of a book by Jonathan Lear a few years ago called On Killing Freud Again, in parentheses, on the same thing. But I mean, part of what I heard in your response too was just about keep in mind the institutionalization of psychoanalysis and different approaches to psychology. I mean, so two things I would say about that. One is, from what I can see, and again, I'm a philosopher, so I'm an outsider to both of these disciplines, but as I see it, there's a big difference between the way that psychoanalysis is understood and taken up in academic psychology versus in psychiatry and clinical practice. And in academic psychology, Freud is, absolutely verboten. I mean, my colleagues in the psychology department at Dartmouth used to say, if anybody wanted to teach a class on Freud, it had to be characterized with distributive designation literature. Could not have, count toward a course in psychology, period, absolutely, end of story. And they were really adamant on that. And that's part of this, disavowal, complete disavowal of Freud from because he's only relevant not as a psychologist. So, but I think my impression is that in the clinical practice of psychiatry, it's different, and people are. I mean, certainly has been the rise of cognitive behavioral therapy and psychopharmacology, but largely because of pressures from insurance companies to have quick treatments that can produce results in 8 sessions or something like that, and analysis isn't designed to do that, and can't do that, but giving someone a prescription and some exercises that they can repeat every night to help manage their anxiety can do that. So, but a lot of psychiatrists, it seems to me, are much more open in terms of and wanting to have different kinds of tools at their disposal that that can help their patients, right? So I think the reception is kind of different depending on what we mean by psychology. But the other thing is that I think is probably hard for most people, most of the students in this room to understand is how incredibly hegemonic psychoanalysis was in psychiatric practice in the middle of the 20th century, even in the United States. I mean, it might have been a very problematic version of psychoanalysis and a normalizing version and so on, but it was the dominant approach to thinking about psychology. And so a lot of this is like a reaction formation, I think, against its. I mean, this is why Freudianism psychoanalysis has to be killed over and over again in a way because it was once so powerful culturally, and so I think it's an overreaction that probably eventually will sort itself out, right?
So I know Giselle and Andrea, you want to have a final question?
Okay, so I would just like Patricia a little bit more clarity on how the relationship is in the analyst and analysand relationship, because and I'm coming at this based upon some of the the need to confess of an analysand provides the opportunity to be interpreted and made intelligible, and to have oneself explained to himself by an expert, by an analyst. And so this leads me to question the claim that the knowledge, the knowledge is being conscious, because it doesn't necessarily become knowledge until someone else interprets it, analyzes it, and puts it through a
then explains it to you. So the unconscious is a place that appears to not make knowledge with capital K that comes from the analyst. So I'm just wondering then about that, the power relation that you set up there, how, like, what does that mean?
Because maybe the one who does explaining to someone else is the analyst, the expert. I was recently asked, what do I think about analysts who are experts on this or that? And I think the only expert in the office is the analyst, who is an expert on their own subjectivity, without knowing it perhaps. Or too much of an expert, and they have all these explanations about themselves they need to follow. So if there is someone making the explaining and someone deciding what's acceptable or not acceptable is the analysis. And maybe I will answer with perhaps two methods. One, that analysis works like a cell phone without perception, that one hears oneself a little, and it's a kind of uncanny moment where it's a little unpleasant to hear one's own same phrase repeated. Because in analysis, we pay to talk to someone, to hear our speech coming back to us differently. That's why analysis is not like talking to a friend. Because what happens, there is echo in the office. With a friend, there is sympathy, there is a different kind of return, but when we hear our own speech coming back while talking to an analyst. And the other maybe metaphor, beside the circle, will be that in analysis is cumulative power. The analyst, and especially in the academic practice, where the analyst may have a dialogue approach to the left to the second, and end at different times, sometimes could be 5 minutes, that could be another. There is the analyst is like a driver of a car, and the one who decides where to go is the person sitting on the couch or lying on the couch. Like the passenger in the right says, I want to go there, and the ride will be as far as the passenger wants to go. And we are conducting the treatment, and we are dealing with the drive, maybe driving with the left drive. We are at that seat, but we can only do whatever the passenger wants, or is ready or willing.
I don't know if, just given my own personal experiences with cab drivers, which have been profoundly negative and in one case quite dangerous actually, I don't actually think that the analyst and being the passenger in a cab gives that person the power, right? Because the person behind the wheel can lock the doors of the car and take you wherever you want. And they choose the route that they take despite what you may say, despite whether or not even when the Manhattan Bridge is the fastest way to get to your house, right? So there's a very specific, there's trust. I'm trusting that cab driver to get me to where I need to go in one piece. But I don't actually have the power in that situation at all. And they communicate back to me what they think I want to do, or they think my home is, and how I should take it there. So
Maybe you're giving me the idea, perhaps we need to transform the American psychoanalysis. Maybe your example is great as the American or the traditional classical way of psychoanalysis, and maybe we need to Uberize psychoanalysis. And let the analyst set up the GPS before. I think Uber is more, maybe, yeah, I think that would be a good idea. So, Uber, that would be the Uber psychoanalysis.
I think I already see the book title.
Yeah.
We'll put it out there.
Yeah.
This ties in perfectly with what I was going to ask, because one of the reasons the narrative about Sorbonne, I think has led to some conversation is because, I mean, we hear the story, she's in a ghetto in Philadelphia, and a Puerto Rican ghetto, and we can sit here and say, well, Sorbonne doesn't realize that she is an individual that's experiencing, all these institutional and social relations that she is experiencing these things her, but she might not see her own subject to it, right? But if the analyst is like in charge of, or is in some ways like the expert of their own subjectivity, right? That's not what led us to understand your story. Like, we understood her position better than she understood her position, as saying like, she's either a victim of a capitalist system that disenfranchises her, and that she's more likely to be shot because she's ghettoized in a neighborhood where violence is going to be more prevalent due to her socioeconomic status and her locale. Like, we can rationalize these things because, like, we can see how the systemic impacts the individual, and see that they're both happening simultaneously. So what support sees as enfranchisement, right? Like, I mean, from my perspective, there are right and wrong. Are there? I'm struggling because what is the transition to enfranchisement, right? Like, what is it become like accruing wealth, and do you buy into capitalism then to give yourself a position in society, and participate and maybe reinforce and maybe prevent social change from altering any of the things that capitalism has done to create a situation. When we theorize and make academic all the things that she's living, and it goes back to our knowledge being better than her own, and just I think we have we have a theory for oppression. We can theoretically understand oppression. We can theoretically understand domination, but I don't know if I can understand or have a grasp of any theory of transition, and especially a theory of transition that gives respect to that person's own understanding of their subjectivity. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I would say that I at least that's the way I practice. I remember when I got the referrals that we have a new patient who was shot in the head, he just out from the hospital, she would die, 6 months of treatment, he finally sent to therapy. I didn't feel as an expert very ignorant. And those kind of encounters with those life experiences, at least that was my personal experience, very humble. And so I didn't know what to do, what was going to happen, whether or not it was going to work. Because what I was told was that she was signed by the doctor and she didn't really want to come to the session. All she did, it wasn't even a speaking subject at the beginning, it was a person who couldn't speak, who was crying and was sobbing. And I think that there is a change of my, and I think this is theorized by Lacan, he talks about the analysis of divine, the physician borrowed from Nicholas Cusanos of Dr. Gherovici. So I may have done my analytic training, read Lacan, all the seminar, blah, 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 Freud, but in that moment of encounter, I knew nothing. And that nothing is helpful. Because the only one who knew, she knew she was suffering. And that's all she knew at that point, and she knew she couldn't even speak. From that, there is a knowledge with not capital K. She didn't know, she knew, but she knew, nevertheless. And proved by coming regularly, and she was initially couldn't come alone to the clinic, needs to be walked by other people. There was also an interesting thing about the perpetrators of the crime having walked, because they were not ever arrested, or there was no resolution for that. And eventually she created a knowledge around what had happened to her, that only belonged to her. And was there, I was working on as a catalyzer, and I was, if there was somebody educated in that process, was me about her life, and about her reasons as well, that implicated her as a subject, because of the fact that she was in the hospital, the mother, suddenly who had been absent in her life, remarried and took over and was talking to the journalist, he was covering the news, and then the mother became the star of the saga and not my patient, and there was a lot of tension around that. So there was a lot of all these things I didn't know. I was educated, so if there is really an expert, I believe the analysis, and I'm there to really be educated into that, which is not, I think, it's not the purpose, it happens, it's sort of side effect. And that indeed we can make it an analysis, a theory, the interventions, I need to go back to your comment, that the interventions, not on the side of knowledge, are always sort of apophatic or comments of returning to her. When she said, when I was shot, I would say, when I was shot, and I stopped there, hoping that would work as an interpretation. I don't know. It's always like sending a bottle, using the aquatic metaphors, you put a bottle with a message inside and you send it hoping it will reach out. And happily that had effects. But I said other things, repeating what the analysis said, that didn't produce effects. So I don't think it is not a theoretical enterprise. We do theory when we sit down in our offices and we write about the case. And the case, maybe the case I'm telling you today is not a real person because it's my own construction. So in that sense, I'm also aware of my own subjectivity and my own distortion of the fact that there won't be any absolute knowledge there. And I think it's something that is often done that always is a construction. What did I choose to tell you and what did I forget? And so on.
This is a perfect conclusion.
Construction, fabrication,
Absolutely, absolutely.
yes.
So thank you very much for coming.